Hi, my name is Donagh Berry and I'm from Teagasc in Ireland, and I am the leader of Work Package 5 of the EU project GenTor. Now, what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so is the development of precision ranking tools on the expected lifetime beef female performance and resilience. For a beef farmer, when he's confronted or she's confronted with beef females, a decision must be made. Should that beef female enter the food stream directly? So should it be grown to be slaughtered at roughly 15 to 18 months of age? That's on the left-hand side. Or should that female be retained to enter or to graduate into the beef herd to produce subsequent progeny? And what we're talking about here is the development of two tools. The first is called the beef own word, the BOW, and there's the publication associated with it that you can dig into the details of it. This is for ranking animals under suitability or their profitability for direct slaughter, so be it at 15 to 18 months of age. On the right-hand side then is what we call the BFPP, the beef females profit potential. Again, you can see the scientific publication associated with that, or if you want to get really into the mathematics and also some more of the details of the results, I'm more than happy to do that. And if you can't get a copy of it, you have my email address at the start of the presentation where you can just email me and I'll send it on to you. But that index then, that predicts the expected profitability of that female for the remainder of its lifetime, including its descendants, if it was to graduate into the mature beef herd. So if we start off with the first one of the beef's own words, here we have up the top for cattle. They all look pretty similar to me actually. So the big question is who's worth more? How do you actually decide this? So on the bottom we have a livestock auction, which would be typical in Ireland. The vast majority of the farmers there, they would just be purchasing these young animals, be it from the dairy herd as first cross on beef or as weanlings from the suckler herd. And most of the selection or the purchasing decisions would be predominantly based on breed, especially for the younger animals, and then obviously breed and a bit of size and just the look of the animal. So what we wanted to do was to put a bit of objectivity to this. And so we developed the BOW as part of GenTor, or the beef's own word. And one of the key things here for us was to use data that is already freely available, so what we would call free nut types. So the beef's own word was constructed using 5 components, the first of which was the expected carcass weight of that individual. Then the expected conformation or fat score of this individual. So we use the Europe classification system in Europe. That is a 15 by 15 point grid used to determine or predict the conformation of fat score of an animal. These are beef animals, and in Ireland we will have a beef performance test station, which enables us to estimate genetic merit for individuals for feed intake. So then this obviously is it because it's one of the largest variable costs in beef production. Feed intake would be also a large component of the eventual profitability of an animal from birth until slaughter, hence why we included it in our index. Also, we included docility because, again, we have that data there and it does influence the purchasing decisions of an individual farmer. So we had those 5 components of traits for each individual that we were investigating, and we took 3 alternative strategies of how we could use this information. So the first one was, well, what happens, what would be the prediction if we just knew the breed of an animal? So we take the breed averages for all of those traits, the breed averages for carcass weight, conformation fat score, feed intake, and docility. And we just apply that to that individual animal. And this would be the status quo, let's say. This is what farmers, especially for young dairy calves, just around 10 to 20 days of age. Obviously, you can't see much of the size there, the muscularity, phenotype isn't being expressed. So a lot of it would be more or less dictated by the breed. So the breed averages. Then we investigated, well, okay, yes, if you know the breed composition, but what if you actually knew the within breed genetic merit of an animal. So what we would call estimated breeding values. So estimated breeding values here are, as I said, the predicted genetic merit of an individual, which includes obviously its breed components as well. And then the third strategy we looked at is what we call production values. So production values are a combination of both genetic effects and non-genetic effects. So they include these estimated breeding values. So these are your breed components, but also your within breed components. But also, of course, we know if it was a bull or a heifer, more times out of not, you're going to be paying a lot more for the bull. A twin, this would be obviously reflected also in its size, but also the parity of the dam has an impact on the weight of the calf, the dairy dam fraction, what we call the permanent environmental effects of the dam. So this would be the repeatability of this dam to producing good or poor quality calves. And then secondly, a crossbreeding effect, or what we would call a heterosis effect. These heterosis effects would usually be more expressed for traits associated with vitality or healthiness. So, and we know when farmers are buying calves, you're looking at the eyes, the sunken eyes, or the ears, or even the nose. So the heterosis effect could have a large influence on how healthy that calf particularly looks. So therefore, it should be included in trying to predict the overall profitability of an animal. So from the national database, we were able to apply this to a few million animals over the past few years, but also what's really important is you validate these results. And to validate our predictions, we took a population of almost 900 male animals, and these were slaughtered over the years 2016 to 2019, and these were part of our national performance test station. So we would have had feed intake records available on these. And these are why we chose these group of animals. Okay, look, it's a little bit small relative to the few millions that we had. But again, we only put through around 500 to 600 animals for feed intake per year. So it was important that we actually had that feed intake data. Also, as part of this performance test station, all the animals are slaughtered at the end. So we would have had carcass weight, conformation, and fat score. And even though we had the price paid per kilo, we would have actually regenerated it ourselves because, of course, prices changes across the month and across the year. So we would have applied a constant price for carcass weight and then a supplementary value for conformation and fat score, so that we were comparing everything on a level playing field. These are some of the results. So on the left-hand side here, we have the index that we chose. The middle is what we call the subcomponents. And on the right-hand side is the correlation between our prediction and the actual profit of that animal, where you take cognizance of the feed intake as well as the carcass revenue. And the status quo would have been our national terminal index. This is the index that farmers use to select bulls. So therefore, it's easy to get this national terminal index of a calf. It's just simply the average of the sire and the dam. So what we would see, using the genetic merit for the national terminal index, a correlation of 0.27 between its index value as a calf and its slaughter profit several years hence, which is pretty good. It looks poor, but when you think about it from a biological standpoint, all the stuff that can happen between when that animal is a calf versus if it's a heifer, 15, bull 15 months later, steer potentially 28 months later, correlation of 0.27 is actually reasonable enough, I would say. Now, if we looked at the BOW, the beef own work, the index that we produced, and you remember there was 3 strategies that we pursued here. The first was just purely based on the breed averages of the animal for the 5 different traits. Then we had the genetic merit, these estimated breeding values, and the third strategy was the production values. What we can clearly see is that if we compare the production values versus the status quo, which is just basing on the purchase of the animal purely on breed, we can see a doubling in the accuracy of predicting the eventual profit of an animal. So quite clearly, we can see a benefit of supplementing this breed averages with additional information. And as I said, this validation was carried out between 2016 and 2018. After doing the study and publishing the results, we actually collected some calf price data in 2019. We did it again in 2020, but we had very little data because of COVID, but we are doing it again in 2021. So from 2019, we had 290 calf prices data, and we also had BOW, the beef's own worth value of these animals. So what we can see is, we call it the transaction index here on the bottom axis, and that's just the BOW, and the vertical axis is the price paid for those calves. Each of the colors represent the different breeds. But again, what we can see is a nice scattering going all the way up, a correlation actually of around 0.6 between the beef's own worth and the price paid for those individual calves. So again, substantiating, I guess, the usefulness of a tool like this in predicting the value of a particular animal. How is this be deployed? Well, for every animal that is sold at livestock auctions in Ireland, this is the kind of display that we get. Obviously, at the top right there, 705 kgs. That's obviously a cow. But you get a lot of information on each individual animal, like when was its last TB test, whether it has been tested for BVD, etc. And on the bottom, because this is a cow, its genetic merit is also presented, both from within breed and in a crossbreed perspective. So it's quite easy. The technology and the tools are already there, because this is linked to the national database where the BOW would be. So it's very easy to actually incorporate the BOW of a calf into this when the animal is being sold. Now, of course, when we developed this, it was pre-COVID, and it's a real pity we didn't have it done in time, because this is really useful during a COVID situation, because there was no physical people at the livestock auction, and it was all done online. So having that tool available to at least give you a start of the value of that particular calf would have been hugely beneficial. The other use, of course, is that once we are physically able to go back to the livestock auctions, you could have an app on your phone, and that's here in the middle. So you have, let's say, for example, 8 calves available for sale. These are their individual indexes, their sex, and you can see that the top 4 have been genotyped. They have a little DNA marker beside them. This would all be pulled down from the national database. Remember, I said that one of the main criteria for developing this index was that the data was already freely available within the national database. So therefore, it's just a turnkey exercise to develop or deploy such an index, which includes the age of the animal, the sex of it, and the index, etc. Also, of course, once you're going around with this handheld, you can look at these animals before they're actually going to the auction. So the farmer could go through them, and you could click on the animal itself. There could be ancillary information available, like the immunoglobulin concentration in the blood. Is it good, fair, whatever. And the farmer could tick off the calves he or she is particularly interested in, and then an alarm bell would ring when the animal is about to go into the auction. So a massive use of agri-tech to deploying this type of a tool. So we go back to our very start. We have these female F1 calves. Of course, actually, the index I just presented, the BOW, could equally be applicable to male calves as it would be to the female calves. But the purpose of this was really from a female calf's perspective. So we've done the value of that calf if it was going to be going for slaughter. The next one now is, well, what if you were to retain that animal to graduate into the mature beef herd? And that is called the beef female profit potential, or the BFPP, also developed as part of Gentor. So this beef female's profit potential is made up of 4 subindexes, and the framework that we based on is very similar to the dairy cow index, which I also have a YouTube video on, and it's also available on the Gentor channel. But the 4 components are the heifer potential, profit from the current parity, profit from the future parity, and then what we call retention value. A lot of these will be kind of self-explanatory. So heifer potential is the profit potential of the animal if it's a heifer. So if she's not yet calved, then she has that profit potential. Current parity is the profit ensuing from the remainder of our current parity. Future parity, as the name suggests, is the profit potential expected for the remainder of her lifetime. So that includes obviously profit per parity, but also the number of parities that this female is likely to live for. And then finally is the retention value. So this is the value of this female if you were to cut her, so the carcass value versus how much it would cost to have to replace her. Because if you're going to cull her from your herd, then you have to bring in a replacement. And there's an opportunity cost associated with that because you actually could have sold that replacement female via the BOW. Again, the strategy we took was to use data that is freely available to us. So within this beef female profit potential, it's actually composed of 17 different traits. If we look at the heifer potential trait, what we included here was her predicted age at first calving. That obviously influences her profitability, but also her live weight, because this heavier animal on average is expected to eat more, so therefore it's going to cost you more. So they're the two components within the heifer potential subindex. From the current parity perspective then, we had the docility of the animal, because we would have national genetic evaluations for this docility, and also the maintenance cost. Again, we would predict this from the live weight of the animal. From the current progeny, of course, if it is a suckler cow, it's going to have a calf at foot, depending on the time of the year. So there's value associated with the progeny of this. So the carcass weight, conformation and fat score of the progeny, the feed intake, and the docility. And those of you that are really sharp would recognize that those individual traits, those 5 traits, are actually the components of the beef own worth. Also, even though we have national genetic evaluations for these, we also have what we called earlier these production values. So we know again that an older animal is going to produce a heavier calf with a heavier carcass. There's a few kilos of a difference between the carcass, if you were to use the same bull, between the carcass of a first parity cow versus that of an older cow. So again, this model would account for all of that. Future parities, not that dissimilar. Again, includes docility, maintenance, the fertility. We would use calving interval in Ireland, survival, and then of course we have the maternal calving difficulty and the maternal weaning rate, which is just another proxy for the milk yield of the cow. Progeny is exactly the same as the last time, but you would include additional traits like calving difficulty. You don't have these in current parity component because the cow is already calved, but in the future parities, this cow has to go through calving difficulty, gestation length, and also perinatal mortality. So if the calf has a high predisposition to dying shortly after birth, well then I've never seen anybody sell a dead calf before, so that's going to be pretty close to worthless. And then finally, it's this retention value that we talked about, and that is predominantly driven by the cull cow carcass weight. Again, we will have genetic evaluations for cull cow carcass weight, and of course we know that cows get larger as they get older, so that would all be accounted for via these production values of the individual cows. Again, like the BOW, validation here is key. So for validation, again, we would have developed these beef female profit potentials, these BFPPs on millions of animals. Once they're in the database, we can generate these indexes, but we would apply it up to over 20,000 beef females that calved in 2017. And these, like this is a relatively small number, but these are animals that we would have had throughout their lifetime and their progeny, etc. And we would have had very good quality data on them. So there would be an ideal validation population. Within each of the herds, what we did was we stratified these beef females into 4 groups based on their beef female profit potential. And this was kind of a self-control, because otherwise what you'd see is that some herds, if they're technically efficient, they're making good genetic gain, they could have all the high BFPP animals, and what you see in the results is an artifact really of the herd production system and the manager, as opposed to the production values themselves. So we looked at the cows themselves, but also their progeny. Just taking a snapshot through some of the results, and again, a lot more of the results are inside in the publication itself, but here in green here we have the best 25% of animals on this index, and on the far right we have the worst 25% of animals on this index. If we look at firstly our national breeding indexes, so our replacement index, what we can see is that these two indices, the replacement index and this BFPP, are actually pretty well correlated. And you would expect that because the traits within the replacement index are very similar to those within our BFPP index. Look at a terminal index perspective, again, we can see the same thing, a decent enough relationship because cows that have good terminal characteristics produce progeny that have good terminal characteristics. And what that does, it feeds up through our models to give these cows actually good beef female profit potential values as well. So this shouldn't be anyway surprising. Calving date, the third row down, is the day of the year of calving. What we can see is that the best 25% of animals, so the cows that ranked highest on our BFPP index, they calved earlier. Look at that difference there, around 40 days. And it's almost a month and a half between the best 25% of cows and the worst 25% of cows. Remember, these all would have been within the same herd. So again, it would have been, the management influences would have been removed by doing this. And on the bottom for survival, this is called the odds ratio or the likelihood. What we can see is that the best 25% of cows had a 62% greater probability of surviving to the next lactation compared to the worst 25% of animals. So quite clearly, let's call it a paper exercise of number crunching. At birth, so we would have produced these beef female profit potential values for these cows when they were born. Many years later, it was still able to predict or to group the individual cows that had the best performance. And that's from the cow's perspective. Now, if we look at the carcasses, remember a lot of these, this BFPP is really selecting aggressively for the female side, lots of calves, etc. So my hypothesis really was that it shouldn't really have much of an influence on the carcass traits. What we can see, look, it didn't really have much influence on the carcass weight, for example, just 4 kilos advantage for the heavier animal, for the higher BFPP cows. Conformation was nice, a little bit improved in the progeny of the better cows versus the worse cows. No real difference in carcass fat, and we can see that age of slaughter was around 9 days later. So they were older in the progeny from these best 25% females. But remember, they weighed around 4 kilos extra too. So when you were to adjust age of slaughter for differences in carcass weight, the difference was down to around just 2 days in age of slaughter. So what we're seeing is that the fertility and the survival of these cows is significantly greater, but to no detriment to the carcass traits of their progeny. So therefore, one would assume it would result in greater profitability. So how you would deploy this in an integrated decision support tool? Well, the first thing is the farmer would look at their herd and rank them based on BFPP. If the cow ranks low on BFPP, beef female profit potential, then it's not going to leave you much more profit compared to contemporaries, so it's a strong candidate for culling. If it ranks highly, then the animal is a candidate for retaining. So the next thing you need to look at is, well, do I want to breed a replacement from this animal? So if the animal has high in replacement value, genetic merit for replacement, then this should be bred to a replacement sire to produce females. And if it's low, then this could be bred to a terminal sire to produce animals destined for slaughter. If you think about deployment at livestock auctions, here 705 kgs is exactly the same cow as the last time. And before I showed you the BOW on the bottom of it, giving you 1,300 euros. That's the value that this animal is likely to give you. Let's just replace that instead with the BFPP. So it's exactly the same thing. 1,300 euros means that this cow here that is available for auction is expected to leave you with 1,300 euros more profit. Now, what happens after that? Obviously, if you're going to pay 1,300 euros for it, it's probably not going to result in any profit. So you may have to bid below it, or it may bid above that. But these are only what we call decision support tools. So they're only tools to help make a decision. And it's a good guide, as we can see here, saw earlier, what is the profit potential of individual animals. So just to conclude, these two tools in conjunction are useful to decide, well, what's the best fate for an individual female. So we can see it's on a weighing scales. So because they're comparable, one can compare the BOW of this calf to the BFPP and make a decision for every animal in the herd. Well, is she going to leave me more profit if I retain her into the mature herd or get rid of her? The tools I've showed you, it's just version 1. It is the deployed, the BOW, like the COW for the dairying, but it is a very basic, and the idea of this is it's modular. There's 4 modules to it. So one can take it away, a module, or can add in more modules, and it uses routinely available data. So it can be deployed for any animal. It's based on total genetic merit. So that's these estimated breeding values plus these crossbreeding effects, but also non-additive genetic effects. And as I said, because it's modular, new tools can be, new traits can be included, or if data doesn't exist for a particular jurisdiction, those traits can be removed from the individual index. But also, there's a large component of the individual traits is still based on genetic merit. And with the advent of genomic technologies, we can improve the accuracy of these indexes further if we were also to include genomic information. And this is particularly true for crossbreds, where we have these non-additive genetic effects, which we know are really important for traits associated with fertility and survival, which of course is key for lifetime efficiency and resilience in beef cows. That's it. As I said, you have my email address at the very, very start if you want to contact me about any further questions. Thank you.